Hi everybody, thanks for checking out this video. My name is Jonna and I am the host of Across the Board here on One Pip Wonder. And today I'm going to be speaking with a sustainability consultant about sustainability. What does it mean for our board gaming hobby? This conversation is kind of directed towards publishers and how they can pursue sustainability in their board games. I hope you enjoy it, and please feel free to leave any questions that you have about sustainability and board gaming in the comments below. Hi everybody, I'm Jonna and I'm here with Derric Pennington. Hi Derric, how are you doing?
Hi, great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for joining me today. We are going to be talking about sustainability. Derric is a research scientist at the University of Minnesota. So I thought this would be kind of a great opportunity to just talk about what is sustainability. This is a word that is just thrown around everywhere. I was just looking at some of the websites that I've been checking out that are more eco-friendly, and from toilet paper to t-shirts to shoes to laundry detergent, everyone is saying that their brand is more sustainable. What are they talking about?
Yeah, so sustainability was first sort of really used back in the early 90s with a UN report that came out and described sustainability as basically, leaving the planet, social and ecological aspects of life in the same state or better than when you uh, did the Earth. So basically, make things, leave things as good or better than it was for your generation, and that's really the idea behind sustainability, and it encompasses a lot of different aspects of our lives. It can be related to social issues around equity and justice. It can relate to financial or economic sustainability in terms of folks not being in extreme poverty, having an opportunity to procure their life needs, and as well as environmental outcomes, related around people having access to the same air quality you had or better, the same sea level or the global temperatures as we're experiencing in the past or better. And that's part of the challenge right now with climate change being a sustainability threat. The fact that will be our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is going to disproportionately affect future generations than our own, and that definitely is not sustainable. And that's why we're starting to sort of reap that even in our own generations. The recent events in New Orleans, as well as in the northeast portion of the U.S. after Hurricane Ida, very much a reflection of climate change. So sustainability is, leave things better than they were when you were here, if you can. Don't make things worse. So really, an idea of cause no harm, leave things overall net better than when you had them, that you were existing. That's the best way to really look at it,
Wow,
and
so
that's the basic definition, and
that's
that comes out of that report.
that's a crazy goal. So when a company says sustainable footwear made from recycled or natural material, they're saying that footwear is going to leave the planet in better condition.
Okay, let me clarify. They that is their intent. Uh, so sustainability, yes, there's the sort of kind of objective definition of sustainability that I gave you. That is sort of the kind of where government, NGOs, some private sector leaders at that time laid out that definition. To use the world's natural resources in a way that maintains or benefits people in the future. Though after that report, sustainability has become applied to a lot of different endeavors. It's been so many things have been done in the name of sustainability, and it's not always you know matches back up with that definition that we were talking about. There's a
Yeah.
lot of in the private sector. I think in general, a lot of folks, I mean, private sector and public sector, but more so in the private sector, sustainability has really taken on a way to, a new market, a way to communicate around new products. And it's basically, as those terms become, like sustainability becomes more top of mind to consumers, there's a market opening, or sustainability gets baked into government regulations, you'll see the private sector find ways to use that term to help communicate how they're being
what
more
they're doing. Yeah. Do you think that the way that some brands choose to use the word sustainability or more sustainable is helpful or harmful in what sustainability is meant to be?
I think it does create. I think what I like to think about with the private sector, and I guess just a background. I do get to work with a lot of like Fortune 500 companies as well as smaller companies. I've done it in a consulting realm as well as in a working for an NGO, global NGO, World Wildlife Fund, for 7 years, and I've got to see different aspects of how sustainability is being used, especially in this sort of what we're focusing on. I think more and more is how to make consumer goods more sustainable, how companies are addressing the challenges that they may have in terms of making things more sustainable. And what I found is that you have to recognize most private companies, especially the traded companies, they answer to shareholders, and those shareholders are there to make money. And so in some ways, I've had some corporate partners say, they'll kind of say, well, if a company wants this widget and it's 100% sustainable and there's enough market, we'll make it. There's of course some marketing that those companies are doing as well, or educating, that can kind of have an effect on what consumers want, and they were kind of tend to downplay that. But in general, the company is really not altruistic. Even though the company will want to advertise and talk about being doing sustainability for the betterment of society, to be a good citizen, I think it's very clear that we're really just doing this to make money and mitigate risks, and we're just trying to be fiscally responsible to our shareholders, which is valid. And then what I want to point out is that the individuals, though, that are working in these companies, and this is the difference between, I think, the company as a whole and sort of what it's doing. The individuals, I think, are often quite passionate, quite motivated, quite savvy, and educated on the topic of sustainability quite deeply, and do have some altruistic, like I want to I want this company to have a positive outcome for the world my kids are going to live in. And there is that tension where what they're trying to do and what they're trying to work on internally in a company, it's always pushing up against that larger overarching goal, which is like how this looks in terms of our end of fiscal year bottom line. And I think topics around sustainability are becoming more are being translated in what companies call more material. They're becoming more material, which means they have more financial bearing on a company's bottom line now. And what's happening is that probably in the beginning with sustainability, there was a lot of lip service. A lot of the concern was coming from civil society groups like WWF or Greenpeace, and it wasn't very mainstream. But we are seeing, especially, I think probably over the past 5 years, an acceleration of these topics: climate change, water scarcity, poverty, human rights, equity. These are becoming more top line with the newer generations, and they are showing preferences in the marketplace for those goods that we could say maybe does lip service, but I think there is a little more than lip service. But we're still teetering on that phase. But at least the companies now recognize that there is a direct either market to explore, or a pretty significant risk if they don't, with sort of their business as usual.
When you sit down with a company and they're like, okay, we need to address sustainability in our company. And I'm sure it's going to be different depending on the industry and the product that they're making and their customer, their clientele. But what is typically the goals a company will set for themselves? Well, like what are they looking for to see if they're being more sustainable?
They'll break the sustainability goal up into different aspects of sustainability. So usually there'll be very common right now to see climate goals. So there's a science-based climate goal where a company has to reduce their or signs up on basically pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount that is scientifically estimated to be aligned with the recommended amount of carbon for keeping us at just only a 1.5 degree increase. So basically, each company sets a target that says, okay, this is the amount I can emit and still keep, sort of global emissions with everybody else at 1.5 degrees.
Okay.
Still not great.
So specific. It's like
they'll have a climate goal that's very specific about how much carbon they can emit, and that carbon goal will relate to their their own operations and their own plants that they have, as well as their energy production or their energy use, how they, where they're getting their energy from, how much energy they use, as well as their upstream and downstream effects. So that means, a target is being judged on how a board game publisher is producing their game in terms of GHG emissions. So they need to account for that whenever they publicly talk about their commitment. And that's really where, just some inside ball, that's really the new space of trying to figure out how to account for these upstream and downstream. It's a lot easier to account for how much energy you're using and in terms of electricity and tie it to renewables versus not and kind of estimate your carbon impact. It's a lot harder when you're talking about tracing, like again, a major big box store trying to trace all of its products to understand the carbon footprint, if you will, for all of those. But that's one example of the goals, and the others would be water.
Okay.
Okay, they would have a water goal and their water use and their water discharges, and then usually there's on the environmental side usually a habitat or land conversion, or we might call it a biodiversity or deforestation type goal. So those are usually the big three on the environment right now: climate, water, and then you can also have social sustainability goals that have become really big now around equity has been folded into that, as well as human rights, living wage, living income.
Okay.
Those kind of issues. Yeah.
You mentioned
So those are the different.
The THG. Did you say THG emissions? I don't know.
GHG emissions. Sorry.
GHG.
Sorry.
What is that?
That's a lingo. Greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, got it. Okay.
GHG. I might have said that really fast. So GHG.
Talking with an amateur here.
So those emissions, there's several different, chemicals and gases that can contribute to climate change. And so they usually get, kind of grouped under greenhouse gas emissions. And then often to be able to talk about them, they're all translated into what we call carbon equivalents.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So like CO2 equivalents. So CO2 is one of the big ones we think about, but CO2 is just one greenhouse gas, among many, and some are much.
Thank you for clarifying that, though, because I'm sure I've heard other people say it. I was like, what is that terrible pollution? It's just a lingo for general bad gases that create greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
Or that greenhouse gas effect.
Yeah.
Am I right?
You are right.
Okay.
So those are the big goals, and they're usually done in partnership with their peers. So usually, not too many companies step out alone. They'll usually step out together, and usually there's NGOs or civil society groups that are helping jointly, usually work with a company to jointly set those targets. So there's an immediate, cynically, which I think is totally fine to accept. I like to be open about being a cynic. I think it's good to be a cynic because you just get it out of the way that folks are motivated off their own interests, their own, and that can be for very things, but ultimately there's their own interests at play. And I think it does help to have your commitments that you're setting these goals be done with other, with environmental groups, because it kind of validates your what you're setting out to do, or a social group.
Okay.
It helps validate that that you did your homework,
Mm-hmm.
and it provides some immediate credibility, which helps.
Gotcha. So when a company is pursuing sustainable practices or transitioning to more sustainable practices, what are the obstacles that a company is going to run into? What's going to be the really hard thing to give up or transition into?
I think respecting how complicated a company can be, especially depending on the size, it's going to have it often its right hand is doing sometimes the complete opposite of what the left hand's doing, right? You have the issue where your sustainability arm is like, we got to reduce GHGs, we got to fight for a living wage, and then on the other side, your policy shop that's on Capitol Hill might be advocating against a bill that would improve the environment because it has a potential bottom line effect. So, and that's very common to have these sort of disparate activities. So I think one of the hardest things internally is getting the individual functions of the organization aligned. And I think really the biggest challenge of that is having leadership at the top in a culture that starts to just get the ball rolling in a more legitimate, sincere way.
Okay.
And then that's probably the biggest obstacle, is probably internal culture, your marketing. There's a reason that some of the biggest laggards in the space are from industries that have probably had the biggest challenges, which is in the hardest obstacle just in terms of what they produce, which is like the coal and natural gas and oil industry. And so anyway, there is this huge, like, there can be bigger cultural shifts than, say, we can look at Whole Foods, and there's a much easier culture shift because they make money off being sustainable, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
so that's probably the biggest obstacle, is this internally. And then the next would be um, you know setting those targets, and once you set them, being mindful of, like, okay, I should have to achieve them. And
Mm.
so the next part is, how do you implement it? And that'll be measuring what your impacts are. That can be really difficult because part of the challenge can be uh, traceability. And some folks will, there's some folks that say, like, we don't know where any of our stuff is produced. We just buy it from this vendor. I mean, it's very common for a big box store to say, well, I just buy my, this company makes my, toilet paper that we put our brand on, and I don't know where the paper came from for that toilet paper. So it
Yeah.
becomes an issue where they have to, like, go figure it out. And depending where you are in terms of a product's supply chain, that's going to be easier or harder for you. It's important to note that the companies that are facing the sustainability challenge the most, or being pressed to face it, are often the consumer facing companies. So you have a lot of
Mm.
intermediaries and parts of the supply chain that aren't consumer facing, and I think those are other bigger obstacles. Part of it is trying to figure out where your items come from, where you source from, and then it's the next challenge is recognizing that there's different incentives for those folks that are producing your goods. They may not have such the reputational risks that you have, and the challenge is that, yeah, I think in a sense you have a little bit of trickle down where, like, well, if your product that I'm selling, if I am a big box store and I'm selling your soda or your board game, and it becomes clear that where you're sourcing the sugar cane or the corn syrup for your high fructose corn syrup for your ingredients is getting, it's becoming clear that it's having detrimental impacts, it's against our goal, and then we're seeing it in either the media or in our sales, or investors are raising that. the company that makes that good and sells it to the big box store also is realizing, oh, the big box store isn't buying as much of that anymore.
Okay.
We're not selling as much. So you kind of get, it'll trickle down where it's like, well, they're no longer, that big box store says, well, I don't want your cola anymore because it's not, it's causing us problems. It's not selling. So then that's
Okay.
pressure
For them to
the cola
change.
manufacturer to say, oh, well, we better figure out how we do this so it can sell. And that's sort of how the current ecosystem works. So that's of sustainability in the supply chain. There's at least one point on that supply chain that has high reputational risk, and it's very clear sustainability in general is driven largely by reputational risk in the short term.
Hmm.
That's what makes it. That's why it's people in the media, civil society groups. It's quite social media can really spur activity, especially in this day and age, how fast things spread.
Do you
Right
hear
or
that, reviewers? Social
so,
media, people need to be
well,
talking about this.
well, you obviously see it. I mean, if we weren't talking about sustainability or just talked about game sales in terms of like based off reviews being good or bad, you that's basically a reputation that's being assigned. That game's terrible or that game's great,
Hmm.
and you see in our industry is uh, very sensitive, I think, to those external wins around the reputation of the game in terms of it being good, great, and yeah, there's a disproportionate probably in our industry more than for a Target or a Walmart or a Coca-Cola, just how much the media in our industry can shape
Hmm.
uh, consumer demands.
Is it reasonable for all industries to be sustainable when there's so many big ones that make such big impacts? Is it really reasonable to expect like a board gaming industry like ours to be sustainable?
I think you know often the sort of dismissal of sustainability in the board game, especially the hobby board game industry, is that we have such a small footprint. We're really, not, we're not big compared to, a large user of plastics or
Right,
paper.
right. The
But I
board
think,
game's always reused, so yeah,
yeah, and that
there's
touches
like,
on another video you've done as
yeah.
from across the board around some of those common, perceptions of why we shouldn't worry about it, about sustainability. But I think, the company can have cascading. I mean, the industry can have cascading effects in terms of our innovations, our desires, our as an industry of trying to procure more sustainable paper, cardboard, wood, plastic.
Hmm.
The innovations that we may help push from our what we need could have impacts much broader across all buyers of those kind of goods or manufacturers of those goods. So we could have influence, but as well as we are a very um, individually, I think each one of us being able to reduce or have that sort of sustainability ethic, or at least kind of
Hmm.
ingrained in what we're buying, can definitely adds up. So I would never dismiss us as not uh, not having an impact.
Yeah.
I think I think it's an easy way to dismiss your sort of individual responsibility here, or from either the perception of a publisher, game action manufacturer, or a consumer.
Yeah, I really appreciate you answering that question because I feel like sometimes that's still something that people seem to feel, even if they don't say it out loud. Like, really? Like, is it going to make that big of a difference? But to add to what you've said, just the idea that if a small company or a small industry can make strides towards sustainability, it just leaves larger industries less excuse, I think. Is that something that you talk about in your studies about sustainability, like
Yeah,
that idea of putting a bigger company that has more resources to shame in a way when they're not really doing all that they can.
Yeah, there are sort of the early adopters or smaller companies that can be more nimble of finding some solutions. But ideally, you need to get the larger masses or the bigger players to have to people's point to have that bigger impact.
Mm-hmm.
I think that yeah, so I think you're totally right on that front, and that's where some of the we are seeing some really innovative new Kickstarters and new publishers really taking sustainability to heart. They're willing to potentially lose some early profits that they might get from doing from using more conventional not as sustainable materials for their components, and that can spur through, again, if there's a lot of media coverage of what they're doing, as well as if they start to see success in what they're selling, to get the attention of larger publishers, that it's even more important to get them shifting. So yeah, I think it's a tough question. I mean, I can always see the idea of needing to prioritize, the idea of getting the biggest if you will, the biggest polluters, the biggest actors that are having impacts on board. I mean, it is true that if you don't get them on board, it's gonna, you're not gonna have the success you want. But at the same time, it's not a reason to not do it, because you need everybody involved, and sometimes, like you said, having those individual choices and those individual decisions, individual publishers stepping out, can create that larger groundswell. And I think getting the scope of Asmodee, and we still really haven't done a study to know what those impacts are of our industry, in terms of what is the impact of 75,000, I don't know, what is it, probably 100,000 copies of Ticket to Ride sold each year, or there's really a large amount of games from some of these publishers. And then if we think about the touchstone with Hasbro, half of our hobby game industry, in terms of its annual revenue, which was like over $2 billion this year, right? But half of that goes to Hasbro and Wizard of the Coast, with like LCG, with Magic, and maybe a few other LCGs like Fantasy Flight, but it's mostly. So I think those are big players that you're eventually influencing. When you start to get to Hasbro and Mattel, and they make other stuff. So I think it's important to recognize that our hobby isn't so isolated.
Yeah.
And it's definitely seeping into major mainstream culture. So I think there's different avenues to have them. Sure.
I gave you a little bit of a homework assignment.
Sure.
And I said, what are the 5 most impactful changes a board game company can make for environmental sustainability? So were you able to come up with 5?
It's tough, and there's different ways to slice and dice.
I'm sure. These
things. And so I tried my best. I think we could definitely go back and forth and have a discussion about those. And
okay,
I'm not saying these are the absolute things, and the ranking might fall apart towards the end, but
it's okay.
or towards the beginning, I guess, because I'll start with 5.
Okay, yeah.
So the I think probably the big one of the things that I think board game the industry, I guess when we say board game company, I took it to mean manufacturers, publishers,
creators,
more kind of broadly.
Yeah, I really wasn't specific, was I? I'm sorry about that. Were you taking it as a manufacturer / publisher?
Probably I had more of the publisher hat on than manufacturer, but I think
it's good to clarify.
But I do think the publisher has a probably disproportionate influence on the system, as there's sort of this touch point between consumer demand and wants, and then and helping both respond to those and drive those, as well as then making requests of how it's manufactured and produced. So maybe I'll put the publisher hat on. I think one of the first things you can do is just starting to talk about it, starting to normalize what you're doing, that you're considering it, and that can be through the process of if you have your own social media platforms, to start talking about these topics, what you're trying to do, sort of get out up front that you're thinking about it, it's on the horizon, you're talking about it, you're starting to create again within the hobby itself, because we are such a close knit, between the publishers, consumers, manufacturers. It's really striking how close knit that we all are, and in terms of like our communication through social media with one another, etc. So I think starting to get that conversation, recognizing your individual role on shaping that conversation, you can think of that also as starting to build markets for this. It becomes the social norms within the hobby gamers starts, this isn't perhaps for some that they think, oh, it doesn't matter, or it's a fad, or
Right.
I don't care. They may start to hear from publishers they really like or designers they really like that this is an issue. We've seen this maybe more reactionary, but towards events during the pandemic around race and equity in general in our hobby, and so this is another one of those kind of conversations to start off. But of course, talk is one thing, and then we have to walk. So the first thing is just talking and starting to get the norms shifting. I think when you jump next into it, it's really, as a publisher, as you're doing game design and development with the designer, it's really, there is a point where you're thinking about, making the best game possible in terms of mechanics, making it fun and interesting and challenging, and something that you want to come back and play over and over again. And those we call mechanics, or the gameplay, the theme, all that stuff. Getting that set well is definitely a priority, and what's coming into that design process at the beginning. But I think as you move towards what components you can bring into your game, I think starting to have that conversation about, just like you would in terms of, do we really need that extra mechanism? Do we really need, as you're streamlining your game in terms of mechanisms, start to think about that streamlining that same process around your components that you're going to use. Think about, okay, and this is always, I think, and I'm a board gamer that has minis. I mean, I think maybe, I don't know if I'm going to discredit myself, or I'll do two things probably in the community: either discredit myself or make other people go like, oh, he might know what he's talking about if he's got that.
It could go either way.
So this guy.
Yes.
So this is the essence
That guy.
of everything. Probably you're saying, well, why? I don't believe this guy if he's got this. And he's talking about
He's not
having
really
that,
an environmentalist.
so that's the monster Cthulhu from the campaign by Command Games, and that was a great game. Cthulhu with Death May Die, one of my favorite cooperative games with my wife. But yeah, I do show some excess there. There could have been a question for, let's say the designers and Simon at the, and I won't name names, but to just say, well, do we really need to put that out there? But there is this thing about theme. So what I'm acknowledging is that in that process, there's going to be,
arguments
theme.
there. Yeah.
What's, and so if I'm going to just be on the creative side, saying that you could have this conversation about how to evoke theme in your game as well as to your mechanics, and it's possible those components can really be a big part of evoking that theme. And I think that's part of what makes it challenging, is how an individual gamer gets deeper into that game through the components. And I think more themed components does mean that you're going to have more of them, and potentially more substantial type materials that go into them, or potentially more impact. But I recognize that would be my second thing. Just one of the fourth places, just thinking about having that conversation and be thinking about not just your theme and your and the gameplay, but also starting to think about, okay, you're probably already thinking about price points in terms of just conventional price points of like, oh, if we do this many cards, we're now going to have to do 2 sheets, or they're going to have to, it's going to cost more in terms of the number of cards can be on so it gets real, you're thinking about those numbers probably that may or may not influence gameplay, but now you have another thing that could be sustainability. So in that design conversation, and we'll probably come back to that later on too. The next one would be, I think transportation, just thinking about, and this is sort of broadly for, I think transport is probably when we start to put on, and I'll put an environmental sustainability lens on right now a little bit, but transportation would probably be, when you start to say, okay, I'm going to have impacts, where do I need to start thinking about mitigating, where I can mitigate those the most. And transport is, I think, very, we have a very much, this idea of more local economies, more support for folks in your community, shorter travel distance for goods means less emissions in terms of transport. And those are all, valid points. But in terms of like sort of the bigger picture, and I'm kind of going back to that previous question, like which things have the biggest impact?
Yeah.
Transport is probably, important, but in our hobby, obviously a game produced, down the street and walked to your house has a lower carbon footprint than the game in China that's produced in China and is shipped over. And I'm not thinking about the cost right now. The cost down might make, that more prohibitive, just the basic, just the actual shipping cost, not the embedded, carbon emissions or other emission costs, environmental costs right now anyway, what's going on. And that's because, boats are not going out as often. There's, there's sort of a premium now on being able to even get space on a cargo ship. But basically a cargo ship, though, because they are shipping so many items, not just your 1,000 units of Ticket to Ride, there are tons of things on those ships. And so, and they're also they're so what you get to hear is sort of a little bit of a dilution in terms of per unit greenhouse gas emission is pretty low because of all those other goods that it's distributed against. And those boats are going anyway. And so, and they also are having less overall pollutant than, say, flying or shipping by airplane. So boats are better in terms of the overall environmental impact compared to air shipping. Using airplanes are going to have a more, definitely a much larger footprint in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per unit, because you basically you can transport less, and then you're also just airline fuel is much more has a much more negative impact on environmental outcomes than shipping. So when we do talk about transport, probably where we see where the likely there's a big uptick would be the transportation from the port of, not the port of origin, but the port of call, I guess.
Right.
And then getting it to your house. And so if you're a company, you could say, well, and this is where it becomes your distributor, or if you own, manage your own distribution center, would be like, okay, what carrier am I using to send this through? And this is where UPS and FedEx and and within this, I'll be U.S. centric within the U.S. sort of government mail system. You have an opportunity to see, well, who's got the most lower, carbon fleet, in terms of emissions, and you could tailor that.
Are there any delivery services that are using electric vans or trucks yet?
The U.S. government, the current mail truck that you see,
the little put.
So that's been that thing has been, probably just that shell has probably been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. I think it's been around for like 25 years. It's the oldest iteration or the longest lasting sort of iteration of before it was Jeep.
Have you seen the new one?
So now they have a new one, right? That is going to be electric, and so
it's really ugly, but I'm very excited about it.
I can't say I'm like the latest version that they have out now is like a total like great design,
it's cute,
but
though I don't know. It's kind of cute. The new one though.
That's the trade-off, right? Maybe the trade-off to get the electric. It's uglier. We always are weighing trade-off.
I'm not complaining.
And I think actually this will be an important lesson here with sustainability. Everybody's goal is try to find win-wins across different objectives of sustainability. And again, what makes sustainability so great is like, why it's a bad term and a good term for some folks is like, for some people it's like, oh, they use it for everything that doesn't mean anything. but because it's so broad, it actually provides a lot of hooks for people to jump onto that have different interests, and it starts conversation, it starts processes. So it's useful in that way because almost everybody can define it, and they
Yeah.
can get on.
You can
But that
relate to
also,
it. Yeah.
but to your point, that there also is trade-offs though that you have to recognize. There's less win-wins and more trade-offs. So often, your desire to maximize one goal is going to come at potentially the cost of another one, and that's part of when we talked about implementation. A major challenge as well. It's measuring, and then it's also recognizing how one implementation that could be great for carbon might not be as the best one for water, and then trying to figure out how to. So it
How
just
to
keeps.
balance
It's
that.
always balancing those trade-offs. So now we're talking about the electric fleet versus the ugly fleet.
Right.
So
I
which one do
gladly
you want to
trade
have?
it.
So and UPS, I'd be remiss to say UPS is also making investments and efforts. Amazon is taking, getting in that spot. I would say all the major uh, delivery services in the United States, and I'm sure there's equal and maybe better examples in other places, other countries, um, are moving towards quote unquote zero fleet, at least in terms of their emissions. Right, there can be again trade-offs, issues in terms of like what do we do with these lithium batteries when they go bad, and how do
That
we
is,
recycle them?
yeah.
What do we do? But but this is sort of that constant that you're going to be in this
That
space.
constant like getting a little bit closer, but then like you still
Right.
have to deal with waste, but then it's
Some,
still a
right.
little bit better. Yeah.
And sorry, what people like to say there is that sustainability is a journey, not a destination. I'm not a big fan of that in some ways because I feel like sure it's a journey, but often people haven't defined the destination. So they've just sort of set out, and it's like if I define the destination, I actually have to get there,
Yeah.
right?
It's a
And
little
so
bit more practical.
so I kind of feel like sustainability is it is the journey, but the destination is just important because you need to know where you're going. But I think it's important to recognize you're not expecting immediate transformation.
All right. Okay, cool. All right. So, number 2. Do you have a number 2?
Yeah. And just on transport, and the reason I just called out because I hear it mentioned a lot. And transport's just has one contribution to GHGs or other and there's also contribution to like particulate matter for human health. But that's just I called it out just because that one I hear a lot. Number 2, I think, would be the focus on end consumers, or the idea of like recycle, sort of the recycle and sort of waste perspective. So what I'm going to put that at number 2. So basically, what. So thinking, I guess we would kind of call this the downstream effects. So thinking about the game's downstream contributions, and that's usually where we think about when the game reaches the consumer and they've opened up the game and they start to interact with it and unpack it. And this is really where we start, is where I'm sticking sort of packaging decisions in terms of can the consumer recycle it? Can they reuse it? Or can it be reduced? And I think so that old reduce, reuse, recycle, I think there is significant environmental impacts tied to how we can manage that waste, because there's a lot of plastic that's not recyclable in terms of unrecycled plastic can escape into the environment. There's a lot of right now unrecyclable cardboard and wooden, mostly cardboard components, from cutting out, punching out tokens that can't be recycled. I think that's something I've learned. One of the through this conversation the past 6 months around board game sustainability is my learning about how little can be recycled in a board game currently.
Yeah, it's
as an end
kind of
user.
crazy.
So I think the issue of thinking about making your game how to be more recyclable in terms of what end consumer you use, I think is still more important than the transport, just because of the volume of waste that comes out of a board game.
Right.
I had somebody just reach recently who's really into Magic. I think he's actually one of the publishers of the game that's really interested in sustainability that we talked about earlier. He's the head of one of those publishing groups thinking about sustainability, but he was talking to me about how he had just made a big purchase into the most recent Magic. Or no, was it Magic? Yeah, it was Magic related. Mm-hmm. And he was just showing me all the different boxes and packaging he had for all of those cards and components. And it was like this huge bag full of plastic clamshell cases and paper, all this stuff. And he showed me this little bitty box that put all the cards in, right? Because he was just buying cards.
Right.
And so there's that sort of consideration. Again, there's the trade-off of like, well, I'm trying, as a publisher, it's like, especially of LCGs, it's like the clamshell versus a paper. First of all, you're trying to drip it out because you make more per unit when you sell these smaller.
The selling point,
right? Yeah, and then there's the issue of the vendor wanting to be able to have, they're going to put pressure on your packaging downstream in terms of like if you are selling at a Target or where it's like, well, we want to put your Pokemon cards. We think those are impulse buys that we'd like to have set at the checkout counter, and we need something that goes into this little
those little things.
And we have all the there's these pressures that you find yourself in, but I think there's a lot of innovation and opportunities in terms of how to make those parts of your game, and I'm just talking about the parts of the game that do not contribute to gameplay. They contribute to ensuring that the game you get, well, also ensure to the game you get is in pristine condition, if you will, in terms of like shipment, and then as well as just the realities of how you're moving different components to eventually get into the game.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. I don't want to pick on Stronghold Games, but their new Terraforming Mars game.
Yeah.
I saw someone made a post, like, they had the whole thing with, like, all the cubes being bagged. That's one thing. That was, like, a manufacturing misunderstanding or something. I'm sorry, my phone went off. But then I saw someone post that they got their game, and they were so thrilled because it was shrink-wrapped, and then it had these little plastic corner protectors on every single corner, so 8 corner protectors, and then it was bubble-wrapped. Like, this thing was shipped to him like a masterpiece of art. And I'm like, why is this the norm? And he was saying, this is great. I want all my games like this. Why aren't all publishers doing that? And of course, there was a whole like throng of people like, because of the environment and the amount of cost. Like, every corner had to be put on by hand. Like, it's not sustainable in any sense of the word. Yeah,
so I did hear about Terraforming Mars and different maybe, I don't know which one's true, but maybe I did hear something, I can't recall who it was, but I did hear a story that it was the manufacturer wanted to basically prevent the number of returns they may get. So in a sense, they're responding to that second consumer you're mentioning, who is one, part of their enjoyment of that board game is that it is pristine. This is similar actually in the food movement or around sustainable food, where less sustainable food may not have as many pesticides or herbicides in terms of the fruit, but it may look uglier, may have more blemishes. And so there's a similar sort of desire of that. And this comes back to my point 5, talk about it. And you start to get social nerves to change.
Right.
Here's another example of that where I love Prospero Hall, and I guess Ravensburger as well teams up with those guys. And, Ravensburger, I have some old Stefan Feld games from the, well, it's not old, but, they're in the early 2000s, and they were using FSC cardboard through Ludifact manufacturing even then.
Oh, wow.
So kudos to them. But another thing that they're innovating on, and it's just to talk about again about the what I call downstream or consumer waste and recycling. Here's Horrified, one of the Prospero Hall games, or any of them you find in Target, and they're going to have these little stickers instead of shrink wrap. Right? They're going to have these little stickers, and that's another sort of just point out innovation. I've heard someone say, well, I don't like to, I've just cut through mine and left them on. And I'm happy. There's other people that want to peel it, and then they're frustrated because it peels off right? I just did it here, right? I just peeled off my... Oh my God, guys! At least it's a good thing it wasn't the front, right, guys? I would have really I wouldn't have been able to do this anymore.
Wow.
And we all know how important this is right here. But anyway, again, trade-offs. You got to
Yeah,
trade-offs.
I think that's interesting because I think that a big problem in our board gaming hobby that relates to sustainability is the fact that people want their games to be pristine is not sustainable. And I feel that publishers that send their games shrink wrap, bubble wrap, corner protected are enablers of this false ideal.
No,
And I know people are going to hate to hear that, but I mean, I just think it's something in our board gaming hobby that like we can't keep thinking that this is going to work or it's going to last.
Right, right. So I think that's getting sort of the point that there's a quality hit to being more sustainable, and I think to a degree maybe, and again it's back to a little bit of that talk about it and shifting social norms or expectations, and our hobby is obviously seeing, you know, that sort of thing change from, you know, just look at any game produced, you know, pre 2006 versus today, and you can see the preference differences.
It's so different, yeah.
That are quite
and I'm not. I think like
so,
there needs to be a balance because it's like you brought up the example of like the food. Like if you buy organic food, it's not necessarily going to look as pretty. That food might go to waste then because no one purchases it because they only want the pretty organic food. So we kind of like have to balance, like walk that line as in our industry as well. We're like we want it to be desirable and to a standard of quality, but not in a way that's not sustainable or unrealistic. Okay, like I am fine with a box that has a sticker on it, and I'm fine with a box that has like, you know, little not perfectly sharp corners. Like it's okay if they're bent and a little banged up. Right. So it's just a matter of like adjusting your expectations.
Right. And there's some desire to create, you know, more biodegradable and this kind of thing. And often that's either if it goes into a typical landfill, it's not going to biodegrade anytime soon, but it is a step in the right direction. But I think just from the downstream of like what a consumer can do with it, you know, say the waste versus recycle or reuse, I think that's significant. Should we go to number one? We could go to number one is going to be tied into just the manufacturing of the board game, and that's going to be the upstream aspects of a game. So the sourcing of the raw materials, the type of raw materials, where they're sourced from, how they're produced, and then the manufacturing itself of creating the actual board game components, the materials used for packaging, in terms of how they're made as well, the components themselves. I feel like, you know, I don't feel, but I mean, that's really where, at least in the board game itself, where most of the impacts reside, is in what we would call the embodied impacts of your board game. So once you bought a board game, those impacts have already happened. They happened upstream in making the board game. Mm-hmm. They were decisions made, you know, it's not up to you, the consumer, to decide you can't do much then. You can't choose to recycle or not recycle. It's already, those impacts have already occurred. So I think,
and a lot of people aren't thinking about that end of it. Like, well, what went into the manufacturing of the shrink wrap? What went into the manufacturing of the little wooden tokens? Like,
right.
It's just one of those things that unless you are told about it, you're really not going to think that far because things are done overseas and behind the scenes.
Yeah, I can give you one story, anecdote of working with one company, and this is a large manufacturer that makes Coca-Cola. So it's the Coca-Cola company. And when I was at World Wildlife Fund, I was one of the longest sort of partnerships was with World Wildlife Fund and Coca-Cola. It was Coca-Cola's longest sort of partnership it had ever had, and it still continues to today, where they work with WWF to be more sustainable. Part of the focus of that relationship has been on water, and it's water. The water focus has been on the water that you physically see in a bottle of Coke. Mm-hmm. what I was interested in, or what when we started to look at, in terms of Coke's actual water, when we look at Coke's water footprint for Coca-Cola, only 15% of its water footprint is the actual water you see in the product, like
Oh,
and
wow.
like the
Yeah.
water you see. The the other 80% of its water footprint is in the ingredients that go into a Coca-Cola. The sweeteners, flavoring, it's mostly the sweeteners, but it's
Yeah.
basically those ingredients.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of Coke globally, sugarcane is used as the main one of the main sweeteners and one of the main ingredients. And sugarcane has one of the biggest footprints in terms of water use. So just to describe how an example of thinking about that next step up.
Hmm.
This might be a little cynical, but the company at the time, when I said, well, I think we should look at sugar in your product and how we address water there. And someone actually at the company said, well, consumers can't make that connection. They can't go, they're not thinking about the water in the bottle to we can't talk about that. That's one step too far to get the
Hmm.
consumers to think about that now, whether they wanted to them or not. But it was basically saying, like, if we start talking about, like, we're reducing our water footprint in sugar because if the sugar goes into our Coke, we've
Yeah.
lost everybody.
Wow.
So and I don't think, I mean, that was in 2013. I think people are more
More
savvy
aware
now,
of it. Yeah.
maybe, but at that time it was like, their marketing perspective, how they talked about sustainability was like they were just going to talk about the water you see in the can, and they're just going to focus on offsetting their water use in those that you see in the product. And anytime I would say, well, actually your big water footprint is all this, like, we should be
All the
offsetting that.
ingredients. Yeah.
And it was like, well, that's too hard of a story to tell. So I think
Hmm. Wow.
part of it's but part of it's recognizing what you're describing. It is sort of more, it's less transparent to understand the upstream impacts. It's definitely it's something that's where other groups or manufacturer itself or the publisher itself can start to provide and shed light on sort of that upstream decision making. I think within our hobby, there's still an open question of, like, what are the you know relative differences in terms of impacts from these different types of products. I don't think we fully know or understand all of that yet, and I think
Hmm.
that would be something to invest in understanding for everybody. Um, but I think this is a huge space uh, for where we can have our largest impact. I mean, again, we have uh, the issue of paper and forest products for both our wooden components uh, and our paper components. Sometimes those can be similar species, but they're slightly different. Usually, pulp and paper is going to be a different species or different type of plantation versus where we're getting our wood. And so there's the question of how that wood is uh, harvested in terms of its impact, whether it's clear cut or selectively harvested to leave some of the trees there that are younger. It's a little more, you're trying to leave some habitat. You're trying not to lose or waste as much product by allowing those smaller trees to still grow. So it's a little more,
Hmm.
it provides ground cover, provides habitat. There's also this issue of, like, are you respecting local people's rights to their indigenous rights to their land? These are
Yeah.
all a lot of different considerations in terms of just that first step of, like, growing the trees or the plantation and getting that product. And especially when we talk about China produced games, they're sourcing much more regionally from areas where deforestation from pulp and paper and wood is a much bigger issue than in
Hmm.
the U.S. or if you're sourcing
Right.
from southeast U.S. forests
And just
or
the
northern Canada forests or European forests. The
yeah.
impact is much different than in Southeast Asia, where we
Right.
have
Because
most
I
of the
was
paper wood products coming from
yeah.
for China-based games.
Mm, yeah. I've been kind of looking into what manufacturers are in my state that produce paper, and the ones that I've found have actually been very pretty good sustainably wise, like using a chlorine free chemical for making the pulp. And from what I understand, that's not always happening in like other foreign countries. And so that's another thing to just find out, like, well, once like the trees are cut down and being made into a pulp, like, because there's a lot of pollution just from the byproducts of making paper.
Yeah, so you've identified. I think that again, that's this one is really big, but you basically when you think about that upstream, and you're laying it out the next level there, where you have the raw material sourcing, and that can be certified by Forest Stewardship Council, but that's just on the production of the wood. It's not necessarily it's not going to that next step, which is probably a different set of certifications that address with the milling or the processing of the pulp to paper, and that can rely on local government regulations. And this becomes an issue of where, this is where I think when we talk about locally produced, it's not the transport that really, it's all of a sudden, it's really these other things, the actual sourcing of the ingredients, and then how they're sourcing of the materials and how they're produced. And if you are producing in countries that have a higher environmental standard in terms of regulations, in terms of compliance, that creates a baseline that's much higher than another place. And that results in less impacts. But of course, you can't do that. You're going to have varying levels of regulation as you go around. But this is part of that challenge in Southeast Asia manufacturing, is that the materials coming into those games are being shipped over shorter distances. Typically, there might be some instances where somebody might be shipping, sustainable FSC European wood to China to make parts, but in general, it's still regional, and that's really a place. That's just a fraught area in terms of the biodiversity concerns, the carbon storage in those areas, as well as just the humanitarian and issues. So you do have several layers, and that's just talking about wood and paper.
Yeah.
And we have plastic, which is another piece of it, where most plastics are oil based, and there's a lot of additives, and of course, its footprint in terms of carbon and water is pretty huge in terms of both its use, its emissions, its use of water, its potential pollutions back into water. Microplastics are an issue even when you're recycling plastic, so just that melting down and reusing plastic. And the microplastics are really where the big issue. It isn't just seeing plastic wash up on the beaches, which is a big concern, but most folks are much more worried about the plastics that escape through the manufacturing process of it. And so that's really tough. Those microplastics are there whether they're recycled or not. Are they more harmful if it's a bioplastic, like a plastic that wasn't oil based but plant based? Is the microplastic still less harmful? I haven't seen good research on that.
Yeah.
Impact. So there you get that trade off again, where the input raw material, you might have ways to offset that impact, but there's another impact that's still there. And this becomes plastic is a pretty big conundrum. But I think, as I've mentioned in other places, and I think there are sort of efforts to at least lessen its impact. And I think that it's a little bit harder to get to sustainable plastics than it is like sustainable, like wood. I think sustainable paper and sustainable plastic are much more difficult to.
What would you say if a publisher was like, is it better to use FFC or cut out plastic?
Well, I mean, cut out plastic, right? Yeah.
That would be better than, like, in lieu of using FFC.
I mean, I think
it's kind of a jerk question.
Well, there's a lot of ways. I mean, again, as a scientist, you want to say it depends, because a lot of it does depend. It's that trade-off issue. I would say
we've had these conversations like off screen before, where we're kind of like, you could go around in circles, but like
I don't want to make an answer to that. I guess too flippant, but I think, I mean, if I had to go and say, I think paper and wooden components are just in terms of their manufacturing, or at least the opportunities to manufacture those with less impact. Um, but again, it depends where. Like, if you told me like plastic
Yeah.
components versus
Do you want to hear?
FSC in a very high biodiverse region with like, I might.
Yeah.
It again, it becomes a. You have to get a little more explicit about that
Yeah.
comparison.
It's interesting because like when I'm like for me it's no brainer. It's like just cut out the plastic because there's so many areas in our life that we depend on plastic. We need it for medicine. We need it for food. We need it in our cars. We need it for like all of these necessities.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one place where we can swap it out and just like forget it exists for, a little while, it's in our luxuries. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, it's easy. But of course, Derric, you know all the details. You know, like the gives and the takes about the conversation, the science into it. I understand it's much more complicated.
No, no, no. I think you're probably. I think on a whole, saying wood and paper, or, wood-based products are overall, I think, safe to say, more sustainable than plastic-based products. It gets fuzzy when you start to say, well, it's plastic that's based from plants, and what I mean is new plants. In case there's somebody out here who'd be like, fossil fuels are based off plants, but but I mean. Yeah, I mean, if plants become sort of the source material for the plastic, like sugarcane, we mentioned before for sugar for Coke, but you could also have sugarcane for bioplastics. So currently, Lego uses sugarcane for, especially their sets that are environmental themed,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
their windmill, their set that has the big. They have a set that
That's
has
made
a
from a sugar
yeah. So
base. Huh.
yeah, so that's a sugar base. So you are getting a smaller footprint, and then you have to take that in consideration when you think about the wooden piece. Um, sugarcane is probably more could potentially have a smaller carbon footprint, environmental footprint, if it's done sustainably in a dedicated space than potentially a forest product.
Hmm.
But then you have to next think about, well, when we manufacture the plastic, what are the trade-offs there versus that wood piece? So there is sort of, you got
And
the raw
can
material and you have the processing. So
and then what it like
there's
is it recycled then, or does it actually break down eventually? I don't think
it
it essentially is plastic,
no
right?
plastic will, yeah, it's still chemically plastic. It might
So
be,
it's still
it'll
gonna
have different,
be.
it may not have the same it's not going to have this as harmful, some, as harmful additives or by byproducts in terms of off gassing, but it's still plastic in the sense that it's going to be in the environment as a hard plastic. I think it's still, from the latest things I saw, it still has sort of a potential microplastic
Yeah,
issue.
that's what I was gonna. I was wondering how far it breaks down.
And I don't know if
If it
it's more,
doesn't break down.
I don't think it breaks down to where it's like, it's just, yeah, it's, and that's a follow up. I mean, my that sustainable, what we, bioplastics or plant-based bioplastics, the same thing with plant-based fuels that are being looked at for airlines and cars and everything. um, that there's some obvious benefits, but then there's these more nuances, and more where it starts to have less differences is when the raw materials gets to the point of looking more and more like the actual finished product, and so you start to see, sort of diminishing benefits. So
Hmm.
you're really looking at the first order, or the production, when we, it's probably much more benefits than as we get refining it into plastic. But that's an open question to look into. I would still say, yeah, I would much rather see this gigantic Cthulhu made out of, sugarcane based plastic, and moreover sustainable sugarcane plastic that's been certified by Bud Sucro, which is the global sugarcane certifier that we have estimated the environmental benefits in part of my work of Bon Sucro, which we know it would have huge carbon and water biodiversity benefits in the sugar industry.
Hmm.
I'd much rather see plastic made out of that than the alternative. Now, there's always that question, like what you raised. And at some point, we probably should mention it. We haven't at all. We just assume people need games, as many games as possible. But obviously, the reduce factor that people have raised a lot of times, or the, either don't buy games or don't buy plastic, or, and I've kind of avoided those spaces because I do feel like those are, I don't want to say they're not extremes, but they are sort of like, they're kind of easy in the sense of like, yeah, we can.
Yeah.
That's
well,
just like don't do it.
Yeah, a lot
right?
of people feel that they're doing a service to the environment by being a board gamer and doing a hobby that doesn't require fuel when they're playing it, or I mean,
Sure.
except for like light to see. So I've heard that a lot of people are like, it's a good thing to promote for the environment. I'm like,
Again, it's trade-offs. It's also
there's
it's always
lots of hobbies like that, actually.
any of these things. You just need to be clear. Like, you need to take the next step of like, well, what are those explicit benefits, and
Yeah.
and what are your trade-offs? Because their argument is probably true for a particular set of considerations. And I do think in our hobby that probably individual gamers, will have a role, but I definitely think it's disproportionate to what the publishers and manufacturers' roles
Right.
really move. And that's really the main point I want to make here is that this is, as consumers, we can help influence through our purchasing decisions. And I say in board gaming, our media providers actually can greatly influence, our own personal decisions of what we buy. But ultimately, what we buy does have a big influence. And so, recognizing that sort of consumer side, both the individual and both just the role of board game media. I mean, especially outside of when you get into the hobby games, because of so many games, and really because they are quite expensive, let alone their impacts on the environment. I think that's a huge place, but in terms of like where we need to shine the light in terms of changes, it's definitely recognizing what's inside the box. Don't get too distracted by. I think it's really important to deal with shrink wrap and all those other aspects, but that you see, and that's why I kind of put recycle waste or end user considerations, further down. If we did do an accounting of a sort of a life cycle, or just an accounting of the environmental impacts, it's going to be that upstream. So I think recognizing how to influence that upstream is, I think, our big challenge, because there's everything I'm talking about in my number one. There's a reason why we're not doing it, or why it's new, and part of it is incentives, costs, etc. that come with it.
Okay. All right, Derric. Well, I think we're going to just stop right here, because I think we covered so much already. I feel like I have a lot more questions for you, but we'll just leave it as it is. And if anyone watching, like, if you have questions about sustainability and our board gaming hobby, leave them in the comments. I'll be following them. I always try to read them and respond if I feel like I have a helpful answer. And I'm sure Derric will be following along. And will you respond to the questions that come up?
Yes, I
Okay.
will. Yeah. And hopefully we sparked more interest and questions, and we were also informative, but we might have sparked more questions for you. And I think my point to leave off on is like there's a lot of room to learn and understand and explore in this space than there are answers right now. And so let's keep our conversation going.
Yeah, and I think it's also just talking to different people that are making games more sustainably. They often have to say, like, which one? I don't know. And maybe it's slightly less sustainable than the other option, but doing something sustainable is better than not doing anything. So don't beat yourself up for not having the perfect answer. And I just want to thank you so much, Derric, for coming on today and talking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
And and thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode of Across the Board.